Hello, it's Bronwen Logan here from the International House of Reiki. And today I have with me Dr. Thomas McAuley, and he is a lecturer in Japanese studies at the University of Sheffield in the UK. Now, as a sort of, I'm not quite sure, but he's going to tell us about this. But as a sort of what it seems like, almost like a hobby, he translates lots of Waka and he sends it out to people who subscribe to his newsletter. Waka is a Japanese type of poetry that he is an expert in. So the Waka that I understand that he's been translating for many years is from about 800 years ago. So that's that's he can tell us more about that because I don't know anything about it really. And I will add to this video his newsletter subscription if anyone else would like to subscribe to that as well and receive these beautiful poems. I've been receiving these emails, we were just saying, for many years. I'm not quite sure how long, but for a very long time. So that means that Tom has been doing that for a very long time as well. And so I think it's been a labor of love, though I see that you have also just published a book with a lot of the poems in that. So that's fantastic. Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us all about this? So maybe a little bit to begin with, how you first got involved with Japanese poetry and, what inspired you to do that?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is that because my sort of research area is classical Japanese and poetry is such an integral part of the society and the literature of the time, that you have to study the poetry in order to really understand anything about the culture and the way people interacted and the ideas about what literature were. So that's why I sort of first got into it professionally. But before I got my job at Sheffield, my first proper academic job was at a university in the Republic of Ireland. And I was the only Japanese studies specialist there in a department filled with people who were experts in Spanish and French and Gaelic and those kinds of languages. And as a way of demonstrating that there was something special about what Japan did, I started translating some poems every week and circulating it just on the department mailing list. And it was extremely popular. People would pass it on, and then I'd get emails saying, please add me to your list, and so forth. And so after I then moved to Sheffield in '97, I kept that up on an intermittent basis as I sort of got used to the new job. But then in 2001, there was Anglo-Japan Cultural Festival to mark 100 years of diplomatic relations between Japan and the UK, called the Japan 2001 Festival. So I thought it would be good to do a little project as part of that. And I got some funding from the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation to translate 2001 poems in the course of the year, make the mailing list more widely available, and then put them out on a website as well, which initially was called Japan 2001 Waka. So I did that and then had my 2001 poems and then kept it going. And then a few years ago, as the Waka website was reaching the end of its natural life in terms of its technical capabilities, I got some more money and transferred it all over to a brand new website, which is www.wakapoetry.net, where there's now over 5,500 translated poems up there.
Wow.
As part of that, I have published some Kindle books, which are available with translated poems in, and then more recently, as an academic publication, a full translation and commentary of a poetry competition called Ropyakuban Utawase, the poetry contest in 600 rounds, which, as there's 600 rounds, contains 1,200 poems, with numerous others in the annotations as well, which I produced. So that's a nutshell story of how I got started and where I am
now. Yeah, I have actually. Well, actually, why don't you tell us what is Waka?
Okay, well, Waka itself simply actually means Japanese poetry or songs. The Wa means Japan, and the Ka is poem or song. When the word was invented, they didn't distinguish between poetry and songs. And in fact, when poems were originally recited out loud back in those times, they were chanted more than they were actually just spoken. So they sounded more like songs than they did poems.
Yeah.
Over time, that term has gradually become sort of narrowed to mean poems which are in the 5-7-5-7-7 syllable pattern, which are often called tanka today. Yeah. The term tanka is generally reserved for poems which are still being composed today in that format, and waka is reserved for pre-modern versions.
Right. Great, thank you. And so, what's the origins of this type of poetry? Is it cultural or social, religious?
Cultural and social, I think, is the simple answer. I mean, the earliest poems of that type we have date from the 8th century, but people were obviously using them beforehand. Japanese poetry is essentially based on alternating patterns of syllables. So there were other different types of poetry, alternating lines of 6 and 8 syllables and so forth. But gradually, the 5-7-5-7-7 pattern took over and became the dominant form. And it was used by the aristocracy in the first instance, because obviously they were only the people who had time to spend time recording these things and
Right.
writing them. For all kinds of different purposes. It was used as there's quite a good description of it by a man called Clifford Royston as the equivalent of the modern greetings card. So if you wanted to send a brief message to a friend, you would send them a poem. And that poem could be, isn't it a lovely day, the flowers are beautiful, that kind of thing, something as prosaic as that. Or if you went out and you wanted to, I mean, in modern times, like, people would go out and they'd take a picture for their Instagram, people would write a poem to depict the scene which they've seen and their feelings about it at that particular time. But it was also used for other kinds of social purposes. If you were feeling disgruntled that you hadn't had a promotion recently, you would write a poem to your superior saying, I am withering away with no light from the moon above me. In other words, you haven't given me any favor or any promotion recently. And they would be impressed by this, and then they would give you a promotion. But the major social function really was in love poetry as well. That if you wanted to impress a woman, then you would write her a poem and send it to her. And if she liked the look of your poem and the way your messenger was dressed and the paper that you wrote it on was attractive, she might then write back to you. And eventually you might then come to actually meet face to face, and it would go from there. So there's an enormous amount of love poetry of various different kinds. It's also true that Japan was heavily influenced by Chinese ideas about what literature should be. So Chinese ideas from that period were that the only worthwhile type of literature for the cultivated gentleman or lady was poetry. And so that's another reason why poetry became much more high prestige and began to develop into an art form with people composing poems as literature rather than just for social interaction.
Right. So if we get to the time that we're interested in the poetry, because probably the people who are listening to this know about this, but the founder of the system of Reiki, Mikao Usui, he included Waka poetry into his sort of contemplative, meditative practices. And that was apparently quite a well-known thing to do. This was only, though, at the turn of the 20th century, so the beginning of the 1900s. Do you know if that was quite common? From my understanding, it is, but you would know better.
Yes, indeed. I mean, around about the 11th or 12th century, then Buddhist Waka began to become a bit more commonly written, and they continued to be written after that. And so poetry then became a means of religious and spiritual inquiry and a way of expressing and penetrating to inner truths.
Yeah.
So as a result of that, then you could use waka, which were composed for those purposes, to sort of concentrate your own mind and to muse about what it was, the particular truth which was being expressed in the poetry. So that's how that
Yeah.
type of use of literary forms developed into a form of meditative practice, as you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, because I'm aware that other martial arts practitioners, that they would go out at the full moon and they would, sit together beneath the moon and recite poetry.
Indeed.
Waka. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so, do you think that it's sort of this idea of it being a song, it sort of fascinates me, because we actually do have chanting practices that we do within the system of Reiki. And we have precepts, for example, which are also recited. Um, where did this change go then from being, this chanting the waka into just sort of reading it? Was it originally always read out aloud, for example, or was it something, I don't know. Tell me.
I mean, it was a mixture of both.
Yeah.
If I mean, in the poetry competition in 600 rounds, then the judge obviously has to assess the quality of the poems,
Right.
and he uses both what the poem looks like visually. He comments on that, so it
Mhm.
appears, it says, but he also says what it sounds like.
Mm.
So it's almost certain that he would have obviously he would receive the written text. He would have chanted it to himself out loud as a way of understanding what it meant and what it felt like,
Yeah.
but then also concentrated on the actual written text itself. There's a sort of a famous anecdote which may be spurious, but was nevertheless is very well known, of his son, who was a man by the name of Fujiwara no Teika, describing Shunzei the judge as clutching a charcoal brazier to himself in the middle of the night, leaning on an armrest, chanting poems out loud, with tears streaming down his face as he heard what they sounded like. So
Yeah.
it certainly was the case that reading out loud, or in this case, chanting out loud, was a very common way of dealing with written texts. And you can think of it in the same way in which, for example, Buddhist sutras were rarely actually just simply read silently in the mind. They were chanted as a way of hearing the sounds and then understanding the entire meaning of the text at the same time.
Yeah, it's like sort of using more senses, I guess, to experience the poem or the sutra.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm. Okay, and the particular waka that we use were written by the Meiji Emperor, and the Meiji Emperor, from what I understand, was he brought Shintoism around as a state religion, so he wasn't so much interested in the Buddhist aspects. So I'm just wondering, is there much of a history of Waka in Shintoism as well? Do you know?
Oh, indeed, yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, there are both Shinto related type waka, and there are
Mhm.
also Buddhist waka as well.
Right.
Some of the imperial anthologies, there are books which are basically Shinto influenced waka,
Right.
and it's also relatively common for deities to actually, when they speak, to speak in poetry. So there are any number of stories of people passing by shrines and hearing a voice from the shrine reciting a poem to them. And it's obviously the voice of the deity which is speaking that poem. So yeah, it was extremely common.
Right. And I guess emperors are. Would that be right in saying that an emperor is a deity as well?
At that
Mm,
particular time, that he
yeah.
was understood to be a living god. Yes.
Yeah. So was it common then for emperors to speak in Waka or to write
Not
Waka?
so much not so much
Yeah.
speaking Waka, but they would have written it very frequently. Yes, I mean it
Mm,
was a standard thing which people of the court were expected to do. They would have had it as part of their training and their experience. And again, it would have been a way of expressing emotions in a relatively direct form, or indeed from looking at the poems which the emperor wrote, which are very often sort of public pronouncements in various kinds of ways. short ways of expressing his feelings or his opinions about the state of the nation, the state of politics, the state of how things are going on. I mean, at that time, I mean, there was a lot of readjustment during the Meiji period in terms of what the written language was and how things were expressed. But initially, at least, then the formal language which the emperor or public pronouncements should have been written in was classical Chinese. That was the language which was used. And while, of course, that's a perfectly a language which can express anything like any other language, it isn't in the kind of way it was used in court and public documents and publications, particularly suited to direct expressions of emotion and opinion in that kind of way. So it's not surprising he would use that mode as opposed to writing a Chinese epigram or something.
Oh, right. Because I was sort of curious when you said it's direct. For me, I would consider poetry not to be direct, if you like. Yeah. Because, if I'm being direct, I'd say, can you pick up that piece of paper, please? But, I wouldn't say, the piece of paper that lies on the floor that, whatever. I don't know. I wouldn't turn it into something, I guess, beautiful to hear and listen to. But what you're saying is that it was actually more direct than the language of the time.
Than some of the languages, yes. I mean,
okay.
We don't have time. I could give a whole lecture about the development of written Japanese or the languages of Japan. I mean, there's a book, in fact, called The Languages of Japan, which people can read and understand how that developed.
Yeah.
So it was quite complicated at the time, and there's again the famous anecdote of at the end of the Pacific War, when Emperor Showa made his surrender broadcast, because of the language of the court that he actually was speaking it in, and because it was written in that particular language, was so remote from the language as it was spoken and understood by ordinary people, that people listened to the broadcast, but they had no idea what he was actually saying. It's a really different linguistic situation from anything that we're used to in the modern 20th century Anglophone sphere. It's so
yeah, I mean, that's this might be a little bit out of your sphere, but the idea that when we chant something, how it sounds is important. But obviously, that sounds like there were so many languages in Japan that everybody would be actually vocalizing quite differently as well, I assume.
Yes, that's right. I mean, one of the major projects for the Meiji government was, in fact, to invent a language which could be spoken nationally. That's why the word for Japanese, which Japanese now use generally for the language they speak themselves, is kokugo, the national language, rather than Nihongo, which is the Japanese language. So Nihongo is what foreigners like me learn. Kokugo is what Japanese learn and speak as a subject, because it's that conception of something which binds the nation together. And it was essentially created by the Meiji government as a way of unifying the nation under one umbrella. Before then, I mean, there still are a very, very wide number of dialects spoken in Japan, and accents and so forth. So if you get someone who's speaking the broadest form of the dialect from the very north of the country, and someone who's speaking the very broadest form of dialect from the far south, they could potentially be mutually unintelligible. They couldn't understand what each other was saying. But they have the national language to bind all of that together, and so using that, then they can understand each other.
Yeah, okay. So is there still an interest in Waka today in Japan?
Well, I mean, I think the answer to that is yes and no, in that obviously it's part of the national curriculum, so every Japanese school child will learn some Waka, pre-modern Waka, as part of their national education. And it's still taught in universities as a subject, and people learn about pre-modern Waka in that kind of way. but really what's the interested in is, of course, is the composition of modern poems in that 5-7-5-7-7 form. So there are tanka circles all over Japan. There are poetry columns in all of the national newspapers on a weekly basis where people will send in their poems in that kind of way. And so it goes along in parallel with, of course, the development of the shorter 5-7-5 form, which we know as the modern haiku as well, which is equally popular and frequently used. So again, I have one of my professors at Sheffield once told me that he was at an academic conference on Japanese international relations, which was held at a town called Sendai. And on the coast near Sendai, there's one of the 3 great beauty spots of Japan, which is a place called Matsushima, where there's a whole series of little islands with little pine trees on in the bay, and it's an extremely beautiful place. And while he was at this conference, he sort of wandered down onto the beach, because the place they were there was close to the sea, and found a whole group of Japanese international relations scholars standing on the beach, looking out there and composing tanka together to express their feelings about that. Now, if you went to an international relations conference in the United States, for example, or even the UK, I doubt you'd go down on the beach and find a group of them standing around composing poetry. Whereas in Japan, it isn't unusual for them to be doing that.
No, it's beautiful. And so when do you think things sort of change, though? I mean, that's beautiful that they still do that, but obviously there isn't, for example, I assume that the emperor in Japan today doesn't write Waka, or maybe he does.
Oh, he does, yes. I mean, as part of the annual series of court functions, at the beginning of each year, there's an event called Utakai Hajime, the first poetry meet of the year, at which the emperor, empress, and all members of the imperial family they compose poetry specially for that event. It's televised on national television, and the poems are then recited and chanted formally. I mean, that's probably about the only occasion nowadays where you will get that, but it's still very much a part of what the imperial family is expected to do as part of their role.
Right. And if we were to recite or chant the Waka, could you give us some tips on how we would do that? Is there anything special that we need to know?
Oh, that's a really tricky one. I mean, the best advice I can actually give on that one would be for people to take a look on YouTube and do some searches for Utakai Hajime or Japanese Imperial Poetry Meet, and see if they can find some recordings and listen to how it actually sounds. Now, the rhythms and tunes which are used for that event are probably not the ones which were originally used back in the 11th century. We suspect they date from somewhat later. But nevertheless, it's a particular different type of recitation, and there are different types of styles of recitation. And again, there are different styles for how a woman should recite a waka compared to how a man should do it as well. So it's quite, and it's not something I've ever been trained in, so I wouldn't feel confident to even attempt doing it.
Okay. Well, I'll try to research that one a little more too. That's interesting. And what do you think are the benefits of working with Waka? I mean, you've been working with them for years. What do you personally get out of it?
I mean, what I like about it is because there are so many which are direct expressions of emotions of various different kinds, is it gives you a link with those people who lived so long ago in such a different cultural and social environment, and it demonstrates that in spite of all that, we're still humans in common, that we're human beings, and that they felt the same way. They fell in love, they got sad, they cried, they were happy, and so forth, and they expressed it in relatively obviously in a very different way from the way that we do, but nevertheless that we're all it emphasizes our common humanity in that sense. So there's that one which is sort of a very sort of personal and emotional link with the poetry. But equally, as an intellectual, they are, puzzles to be unlocked and tinkered with, and you see the techniques which are used to put them together, and the clever use of wordplay and the references which they introduce to other literary works or other poems. So they're sort of endlessly rewarding in sort of seeing how those actually all fit together, and so how the meaning from the one poem can be expanded by references to others, which was a relatively common technique. And so there's that sort of puzzle aspect of it as well. And equally, that too is one of the things which makes them challenging and interesting to translate, in terms of thinking about how to express all of those techniques and meanings in a way which can be accessible to people living 1,000 years later than they were written.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's beautiful. Thank you for your time today. And that's been very enlightening. We don't really know much about it ourselves, and it's quite hard to find out specific information without reading complete enormous books, and things like that about it. So no, I really appreciate that. And as I said, I'll let everyone know your details, and people can sign up and listen and read some of those, because you're actually reading it out aloud now too, aren't you? You're making little videos.
I've started to do some videos to read them out and then give some further commentary compared to what's just on the mailing list as well.
Yeah, well, that's interesting too. So thank you very much for that. And
just to say, if people are interested in the sort of religious side of Waka, then I do recommend this particular book, which is called The Wind from Vulture Peak by Stephen Miller, subtitled The Buddhification of Japanese Waka in the Heian period. So he talks quite a lot about how Waka became means of philosophical and Buddhist inquiry as well, and also, of course, touches on Shinto as well. So if people are interested in that, then I recommend taking a look at that book. There's lots of beautifully translated poems in it too, so that's also well worth looking at.
Great. I appreciate that. Well, thank you very much for your time today.
That's okay. That's no problem at all. Cheers, Anne. Thank you.
Bye.